When we hear the word crisis, most of us expect to hear about an emergency. An accident is a crisis. A hurricane is a crisis. An epidemic is a crisis. The word crisis gets our adrenaline pumping, and we think about how to respond to this particular crisis. Well, every time we have to make a life-changing decision, we also experience a crisis. Our choice will determine the course of life from that moment on. A crisis is also a turning point in our lives. When Jesus walked on this earth, he was a crisis for everyone who met him. And Jesus described that crisis in a passage from Luke that we just heard read. Jesus came to bring fire to the earth. He came to divide households, father against son, mother against daughter, in-laws against in-laws. And for him, his death was a baptism he was facing in the near future. And he faced a crisis of decision with that. Would he go to the cross or would he not? Would his followers go with him to the cross or would they run away from him and his message? Because Jesus' decision would determine the course of his life and everyone else's life for the rest of time. Deciding whether to follow Jesus or not was a crisis for people for many centuries during and after his time on earth. Because following Jesus was a radical decision because it changed people's lives in profound ways. Jews who decided to follow Jesus were immediately at odds with every other Jew. Families whose children became followers of Jesus were advised to kick their sons or daughters out of the house. Jews in Roman society were given special exemptions from bowing to Caesar, military service, and persecution. Christians were not. Having a Christian under your roof placed the whole family in peril. Jews in Roman society formed their own communities in which all commerce, all trade, and all relationships were made. A Christian family member would endanger the family's ability to make a living, have friends, and find spouses for their children. Jews in Roman society increasingly found themselves at odds with Christians. Having a son or daughter announce to their parents that they were Christian would be similar to having a son or daughter come out as LGBTQ+ today. Strictly conservative, religious parents simply could not tolerate having those children under their roofs or part of their families. Now, in the first century, people in the Western and most of the Eastern world either believed in the one God of Judaism or they worshipped idols. Over 99% of Romans and people who were part of the Roman Empire worshipped idols. Anyone who did not worship an idol was considered an atheist. Any Romans who were Christians were immediately criminals because being a Christian was against the law in Rome. And they could no longer bow down to Caesar. They could no longer bow down to the idols of their families, their cities, or their states. Having a relative who claimed Jesus as their only God put them at odds with everyone else in the family, with their employers, with their friends, with their neighbors. Following Jesus changed lives and threatened every other relationship in a person's life. That means following Jesus was a radical decision. Following Jesus changed a person's life in radical ways. Following Jesus caused the follower to put Jesus and his teachings before family, before work, before friends, and before the government. Following Jesus was a profound commitment that required each person to think about just how much of their lives would be changed. Following Jesus meant inviting the fire of God into your life as well as the lives of those around you. Now, the fire that Jesus was talking about that he wanted to bring to earth was the fire of God that either purified or burned a person's life. Those who followed Jesus expected God to change them. They invited God to fill them with a desire to follow Jesus, with his desire for peace, justice, hope, compassion, kindness, and humility. Roman society was, well, not many of those things. Roman society was maintained through violence and oppression. Everybody accepted a system of classism, a system that involved bribery, a system that involved slavery, and a system that really caused one to have concern for oneself above all. And Jesus didn't just bring fire to the Roman system, he brought fire to the systems of the temple in Jerusalem that catered to Roman desires. Jesus brought fire to those whose loyalty was divided between God and the Roman Empire. Jesus brought fire to a system of belief that turned a blind eye in what was called necessary cooperation with Rome. Jesus came to purify the hearts and the lives of all he encountered. Excuse me. He came to help us be transformed into the people God created us to be. He came to help us recognize and desire to live God's love of justice, mercy, compassion, and accountability. He came to heal us. He came to fill us with hope and put us to work helping to create the kingdom of God on earth. In short, Jesus came to melt our hearts with the fire of God and shape us into the new people of his name. We live in a time where we still distinguish between classes. We're just really better at hiding it. But most of us, and I'm not exempt from this, look at the way a person is dressed. We look at the work somebody does. We look at the words they use, the cars they drive, the appearance that they foster, and the level of education they've achieved. And we decide who's in our class, who's above us, who's below us. We live in a time where violent crime statistics are down, even though we've experienced 253 mass murders in the United States this year. We live in a time where networking is often another way of talking about bribery. We live in a time when pundits are predicting that our next great battle, our next great crisis in this nation will take place between the haves and the have-nots. Now, most of us, me too, most of us have not experienced following Jesus as a crisis event. We don't usually experience Christianity as radical. But it is time for each of us to look at following Jesus as something more than coming to church on Sunday, something more than prayer, Bible study for self-education, and singing songs. Because we have managed to tame Jesus in our hearts, and in our actions, and in our churches. It's time for each of us to think about just how radical following Jesus is supposed to be. It's time for us to realize following Jesus means actively working for justice, which means a fair opportunity for all people. Excuse me. Will we follow a Jesus that wants to transform us into people who stand up for equality, who fight for fairness, who display compassion and believe in accountability in ourselves and others? Or will we follow the Jesus our century has turned into a nice, faithful guy who died on a cross so we can all go to heaven? Friends, salvation is just the first step of following Jesus. Once we name Jesus as our Christ, the Son of God, heaven is guaranteed. That's a given. But are we willing to take the next step and become disciples, followers of Jesus? Are we willing to take that next step and become just a bit radical? If we want to take that second step, well, let's put it this way. If we're content with following Jesus, the nice, faithful guy who died on a cross, we don't have to do anything more. We're set. But if we want to follow Jesus, the Jesus of the first century, the man, the teacher, the prophet who challenged injustice, who smashed ideas of classes, who welcomed all people as loved by God, and who invited his followers to be transformed, we need to get to work. First, by studying what Jesus said, to whom he said it, why he said it, and the context in which it was said. And then we need to discern what the truth of those teachings were and begin to apply those truths to our lives. We need to take action by inviting people to become acquainted with the Jesus that we know in the Bible, the radical, justice-loving, transforming Jesus. We need to take action to oppose injustice by insisting all people be treated fairly. We need to take action to close the gap between the haves and the have-nots through education, through healthcare, through jobs with a livable wage, and by humbly going where those who are different from us live, work, and play. We need to take action by voting and then holding our elected representatives accountable to what we voted them for, namely their beliefs and their policies. We need to take action by holding our churches and our church leadership accountable. We need to talk and walk the message of Jesus. That's if we want to follow the Jesus of the first century, that radical, justice-loving, class-destroying, compassionate man who invited us all to grow closer to God by learning to do what he did, to be how he was, to live as he lived. If we want to be those radical people, those radical followers of a radical Jesus, it will come when we decide to follow the radical Jesus who presents us today with a crisis of decision. Will we claim Jesus as our Christ? When we claim Jesus as our Christ, heaven's guaranteed. But the day we say yes to following the radical Jesus is the day God begins to transform us into the people God really created us to be. Those who are willing to help create heaven on earth. And that takes some radical action, friends. Amen.